Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this in-depth segment dedicated to the most pressing health issues facing both humanity and our planet. Today we are discussing a silent yet omnipresent threat, an invisible threat that has now become an integral part of our daily lives: microplastics and nanoplastics. This is no longer merely an issue of environmental pollution. As we all know, we are facing a real global health emergency that strikes at the very heart of our future: public health, the development of new generations, and the integrity of the biological mechanisms we once thought protected us. The water we drink, the food we eat, even the air we breathe. Everything now contains fragments of plastic. But a recent discovery has marked a point of no return in scientific research. For the first time in history, micro and nanoplastics have been detected in human placentas and breast milk. This discovery has clearly shaken both the scientific community and the public, as it calls into question a fundamental certainty: the effectiveness of biological barriers that, until yesterday, we considered impenetrable. And today, we have the honor of exploring these issues with one of the leading figures behind this discovery, a discovery that has marked a turning point in contemporary medical research in this field. Professor Antonio Ragusa, surgeon, specialist in obstetrics and gynecology, consultant to the Ministry of Health, and author of the book Nati con la camicia, di plastica, Born Lucky, in Plastic. Professor Ragusa, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, which I was more than happy to accept. When I was conducting this research, I was the director of obstetrics and gynecology at the hospital on Tiber Island in Rome. Currently, I am the director of the obstetrics and gynecology department at the Sassuolo Hospital in Emilia-Romagna.
How did you come up with the idea for this research and what drove you to pursue it?
I was in a wonderful place in Italy, in Sardinia, a place called Piscinas, located in the Sulcis region in southwestern Sardinia, which is an old mining area. But it's a place that is, let's say, very secluded, very pristine, where there's absolutely nothing around for 6 or 7 kilometers. While taking a walk at a certain point, I noticed some brightly colored shiny objects sparkling on the beach. And I asked my wife, "What is this stuff?" She looked at me, a bit puzzled. She said, "Well, it's plastic." I replied, "Wait, plastic? How could plastic possibly end up here when there isn't anything around for 7 or 8 kilometers? And she gave me an even more, well, a look that made my utter lack of understanding quite clear. And she said, "It comes from the sea, obviously." So from that moment on, a thought process began in my head. I realized that if plastic could colonize the sea and wash up in such pristine places, it could also reach the inside of the mother's womb, and therefore, the babies. And naturally, I then decided to put this intuition into action. I am a gynecologist, a doctor who delivers babies, so up until that point, I knew about as much about plastic as the average person. But I started reading, studying, and reaching out to scientists who worked with advanced microscopes. Specifically, a highly skilled professor working on the opposite side of Italy, in the Marche region. She was working with a Raman microscope. A Raman microscope allows you to, let's say, examine tissues and determine if there is plastic inside them. We use the word plastic for simplicity's sake, but of course, the term encompasses an extraordinary level of complexity. There are dozens and dozens of types of plastic. Essentially, they are tiny fragments, polymers, meaning repeating chains extending endlessly, made of materials we use constantly, every single day. So, we sent the placentas to this professor, and she did an outstanding job. She was able to locate and identify plastic within the placentas for the very first time. We are talking about microplastics, extremely small particles invisible to the naked eye, much thinner than a human hair. She was even able to categorize them because Raman microscopy allows us to type the material, meaning it can identify exactly what kind of plastic is present. Not always, though. There are limitations because plastic is rarely pure. It is usually coated in substances designed to make it harder or softer, to make it flame retardant, or to enhance its color. In short, there are a range of additives used to make it better suited for its intended purposes. And the uses for plastic are, I think, infinite. It is the second most widely used material in the world after concrete, so it is everywhere. We found it there, and as you mentioned, the paper we published in 2021 caused quite a stir. Naturally, the idea of plastic inside the placenta, and therefore inside our babies, was something that, understandably, shocked people. But looking at it that way isn't entirely correct, because the plastic we find in the oceans is the same plastic now being found in our babies. It's a closed loop. Let's be clear. Of the millions and millions of tons of plastic we produce, less than 10% is recycled, while over 90% is discarded into the environment. Discarded into the environment means that, over time, the plastic degrades into smaller and smaller particles, eventually becoming very small, microplastics, or even extremely tiny, nanoplastics. These particles travel down the rivers, reach the seas, and colonize the ocean. They are ingested by the fish we subsequently eat, and so they find their way into us. So plastic undergoes a cycle. I wouldn't call it a virtuous cycle, but a vicious one, because over 90% of it is abandoned in the environment. Italy is actually a particularly virtuous country, in quotes, meaning it recycles about 10% of its plastic. That makes it one of the most responsible countries in the world in this regard. However, the fact remains that more than 90% still ends up in the environment. So how does it get inside us? How do these micro and nanoplastics enter our bodies? They do so through three primary pathways. The first is through our food. We've mentioned fish full of plastic, which we eat. But it's not just fish. The most significant way plastic enters our bodies, from a quantitative standpoint, is through plastic bottles. Plastic bottles used for water or carbonated drinks are a dramatic and utter absurdity. Plastic itself is not inherently bad, of course. It is a material that can be used to create wonderful things. Think of medical prosthetics, or the sheathing that brings high-speed fiber optics into our homes. In short, many highly useful applications. And in those contexts, it's fine. But when we use it for something as foolish as water bottles, I am not a fan of mineral water producers, and the feeling is mutual. So, we use it for 10 minutes, for a soda or water, and then toss it into the environment. That is a foolish way to utilize an otherwise highly useful material. So, as we said, one of the pathways through which plastic enters the human body is through the digestive system. Another is through olfaction, the nose, and breathing, because there is a massive amount of plastic dispersed in our atmosphere. For example, every time you hit the brakes in a car, the friction releases thousands upon thousands of microplastic particles into the environment. So, if you live near a highway or a busy intersection with traffic lights, you are inhaling vast amounts of micro and nanoplastics. So we've covered the intestinal tract and the respiratory system. The third pathway is through the skin. Clothes, specifically the so-called fast fashion industry. Fast fashion is one of the most terrible blights on the world today. You may not realize this, but there are companies, mostly Chinese, but not exclusively, though the Chinese firms have the highest revenues. So those companies manufacture clothing imitating high-end designers, while entirely bypassing the traditional supply chain. They produce these synthetic garments that perfectly imitate natural fibers, but they only last one season, often even less. Then they are discarded. Aside from the fact that we wear them directly against our skin, meaning we absorb plastic into our systems through our skin, when we throw them away, they feed right back into that vicious cycle we mentioned earlier. So, those are the three pathways through which plastic enters us: respiratory, dermal, and dietary. And what does it do once inside? It enters the bloodstream. Until relatively recently, about 15 years ago, plastic was thought to be biologically inert. And indeed, if you look at little plastic pellets, not microplastics, I'm talking about macroplastics, and drop them in water, they just sit there peacefully. They don't seem to interact with their environment all that much. However, once they are reduced to micro and nanoplastics, they enter the human body through those three pathways, make their way into the blood, and through the bloodstream, they infiltrate all the parenchyma, meaning the major organs, the kidneys, the liver, the heart, the arteries, the veins, the placenta, and breast milk, which was also a terrible discovery made by our team, and that too caused a major scandal. And what do they do there? Because we then asked ourselves the question, okay, I get it. They enter, they go there, they go into the organs, but what do they do to these organs? Well, the organs don't recognize them. Because plastic is a very recent material, it's only about 70 years old. It didn't exist before. Therefore, the body treats it as a foreign object. But the foreign objects that the body is familiar with, I'll keep this brief, otherwise we'll be here all day, are external antigens, or bacteria, viruses, fungi, and so on. So the body, or the cell, behaves exactly as if this foreign object were one of these biological agents it has known for millions of years. But that's not the case, because plastic is indestructible. It is not like those other agents. So what exactly happens inside the cell? We conducted some extraordinary research and discovered that the plastic makes its way into the cytoplasm. For those without a background in biology, let's just say that a cell is composed of a nucleus, where the DNA is located. And plastic, for reasons we still don't fully understand, does not go in there. And a cytoplasm, which contains organelles, little organs that ensure the functioning and life of the cell. So, the plastic enters the cytoplasm, stops there, and is surrounded by a membrane, similar to a cell membrane. In other words, the cell isolates it because it wants to destroy it, producing a series of enzymes and substances that the cell typically uses when invaded by microbes, viruses, bacteria, or antigens. Except that, unlike those natural elements, plastic is indestructible, as we were saying. Consequently, the cell is essentially subjected to chronic stress, and so it gets sick. What does it mean that it gets sick? It gets sick. Yet, the babies born in our hospital, whose mothers had plastic in their placentas or in their breast milk, were perfectly healthy. So what does getting sick actually mean? It means getting sick in the long term. That is to say, plastic inside the human placenta and breast milk, but let's stick to the placenta for now, doesn't only have immediate consequences. For instance, premature birth. The more plastic there is in the placenta, the more likely babies are to be born prematurely, unfortunately. Or the fact that these babies are smaller compared to babies exposed to lower amounts of plastic. But it also has long-term consequences. Namely, it alters epigenetic mechanisms, meaning this cellular programming triggers diseases that will manifest when that individual becomes an adult, say, at 40 or 50 years old. And these diseases are exactly the ones that are currently devastating, or, let's use a less dramatic word, burdening our world. These are the so-called non-communicable diseases: obesity, hypertension, diabetes, and metabolic syndrome. What I am telling you has been thoroughly proven in laboratory animals, including mammals. That is, despite having zero caloric value, plastic causes weight gain because it triggers a shift in cellular energy production. We've seen that it colonizes the cytoplasm, right? We have conducted studies on this with dramatic photographs taken using scanning and transmission electron microscopes, where you can actually see the plastic destroying the mitochondria, which are the powerhouses that produce the cell's energy. Or it destroys the endoplasmic reticulum, which has a wide array of functions that we won't list right now, but there are many. And if this happens in a baby and a fetus, in the placenta, in the amniotic fluid, and so forth, and then again during breastfeeding, it causes what are called epigenetic modifications in DNA expression. The DNA itself remains the same, it doesn't change. We've seen that plastic doesn't enter the cell nucleus, but the expression of the DNA changes dramatically due to the modification of these cytoplasmic organelles. This is extensively proven in animals. Mice, monkeys, hamsters, and so on, when infested with plastic, show non-communicable diseases like diabetes, obesity, hypertension, and even autism-like behaviors. In humans, this has not yet been proven. We are working on it, but science takes a very long time. This is a challenge in science, but it's also a guarantee of quality. I mean, clearly, obtaining results in animals, as unpleasant as it is for the poor animals, is faster. Because you can design experiments that simply cannot be conducted on humans. Human research requires more time, more patience, and more capability. But I believe that what we've seen in animals will soon be proven in humans as well. Humans are no different from other animals. We are just a bit more complicated in some aspects, and perhaps a bit crueler.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you so much for the explanation. First of all, it was incredibly thorough. You've already touched on how micro and nanoplastics affect cells. But I'd like to ask you if there is, let's say, data in this field regarding how these mechanisms of influence manage to impact embryonic development and what potential consequences could arise from this exposure.
As I've mentioned, there are already some studies, certainly not a huge number, but there are several published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, highly rigorous ones with a high impact factor. These studies demonstrate that the more plastic there is in the placenta, the more likely babies are to be born prematurely. We must keep in mind that prematurity is the primary health challenge for humans today. In Italy, about 7% of babies are born prematurely, and in the United States, a country with a demonstrably less effective healthcare system than Italy's, it's 12%. So in this sense, increasing this number represents a dramatic and significant cost to humanity. A biological cost, naturally, for the families and everyone involved, but also an economic one for those who only care about money. We already have evidence that plastic can trigger this in humans. We also see babies being born smaller. Babies infested with, I use the term infested because plastic acts as an infesting agent, a pollutant. So, babies infested with plastic are, well, in a scientific article of ours that caused quite a stir and has been widely cited, we call them cyborg babies. We call them that because they are children composed of organic material, but also of inorganic material, like plastic. And these babies are smaller. They generally have a reduced brain size compared to other babies. And very few manage to be not uncolonized, because plastic is omnipresent, but less colonized by plastic. In this regard, a mother's daily habits are important. I don't mean that individual habits can solve the global plastic problem. They certainly can't. However, for your own child, it makes a real difference if you don't drink water or sodas from plastic bottles, if you don't buy food wrapped in plastic packaging, and if you don't order takeout, or do so very rarely, only when necessary, because takeout food, for various reasons, is much more heavily loaded with plastic than other foods. It matters if you don't use plastic bags, or if you must use them, use heavy-duty ones that can be reused hundreds of times, though canvas bags are better. Avoid buying synthetic clothing. I do realize that this is an investment not everyone can make. Not everyone in the world can afford to buy wool instead of cotton or silk. That is a serious problem. But in short, don't use single-use plastic. Plastic cups, plastic forks, and knives. And don't fall for the compostable gimmick, because compostables, as the name suggests, are only compostable if placed in a specific facility that breaks them down. If you throw them in the regular trash, they behave exactly like any other plastic. So, it's just a trick to bypass the single-use problem. So your habits, as an expecting mother, can somewhat influence the amount of plastic passed on to your unborn child. Again, while individual habits serve as a good example, they won't solve the plastic crisis. This is an economic and political issue. I say economic and political in that specific order, because today, the economy is much more important than politics. Politics barely exists anymore, and it is entirely subservient to the economy. Consider this. Perhaps you already know it, since you cover this topic. But plastic is a petroleum product. 60% of the plastic produced in the world is manufactured by fewer than 24 companies. So what is happening globally is that a few companies, primarily Chinese and American, are making billions in profit. I have nothing against making a profit. That's perfectly fine. But doing so at the expense of all humanity is not okay. Are there solutions? Yes. But for now, the solutions are neither medical nor biological. They are political. Specifically, reducing plastic production, which is the exact opposite of what is currently happening. Think about what happened during COVID, for example. Because global mobility was reduced, the primary use for petroleum, transportation, dropped significantly. So producers shifted their focus to manufacturing virgin plastic, the production of which increased dramatically, allowing them to profit even more. So right now, the world is not moving in the right direction regarding plastic. Now, an old man like me only cares up to a point. However long I may live, and I hope it's a while, yet I doubt it will be more than another 20 years or so. But for people of your generation, it is a massive problem. And this makes me a bit angry. When I used to lecture at the university and discuss these topics, my students would say to me, "Okay, professor, but you're the ones who left us the world in this state." And I couldn't help but admit that yes, it was true. But setting that aside, the problem is yours now. So, whether you like it or not, you have to take on this issue and fight for a political solution. That means electing politicians who possess this kind of awareness, not politicians whose only thought is to take the poor 1,000 immigrants who arrive, send them back, and call it a day, but politicians who talk about the things that are vitally important. And there aren't many of those. You can count them on the fingers of one hand. One of those vital things is the environment we live in, and plastic is one of the most significant factors affecting it. We don't need to destroy or eliminate plastic entirely. We simply need to minimize single-use plastics and end the absurd way we are currently using the material.
I wanted to ask you, as a specialist who has dedicated many years to this problem and who understands the mechanisms of cellular-level exposure, obviously much better than the average person who might not be informed about this specific issue, which is why I think it's highly important. And it's the reason we try to contact experts like you, to bring this to the public, to raise public awareness about the problem caused by the presence of these substances. These infesting agents, as you called them. Well, to put it bluntly, we found this information quite alarming. We've started seeing it as a sort of epidemic or pandemic of this new pollutant. Do you have hope for the future in this regard? Or are you also, let's say, shocked and frightened? How do you personally feel about the presence of this issue? Do you think it will have a massive impact on the future of humanity, or how do you see it?
Someone once interviewed Woody Allen, whom I like a lot, and the journalist asked him at one point, "Are you a pessimist?" He replied, No, I am an optimist who has lived. I've always loved that definition. I, too, am an optimist who has lived. I think that I wrote a scientific paper titled The Inconsistency of Human Thought. The title alone says it all. I explain the reasons in detail there. I won't go into all the details now, or I'd bore you for the next half hour. But the paper is available in the scientific literature, so anyone can read it. In it, I clearly explain the reasons behind what we are currently doing to the world. There are reasons inherent to our intelligence, to our capacity to analyze reality, and to our way of interacting with the world as builders. We are living beings like all other living beings. But while all other creatures occupy a specific niche or latitude and adapt to it more or less perfectly, humans, along with rats, Though rats only do it because they follow us, colonize the entire world, from the Arctic to the Antarctic. Humans go everywhere. As we said, we are a migratory species. And we don't adapt to the world, we modify it. This anthropological concept explains a great deal of human behavior, including this terrible current drive to dominate nature with extraordinary sheer power. We have gone from being creatures terrified of what happened in the natural world. Just think of a naked man or woman in the forest of Borneo, with no formal education, terrified of lightning, thunder, wild animals, and so on. Think of the sheer terror of this formidable and terrifying nature. Within the span of a couple of centuries, we have gone from that to being the thing that is terrifying to nature, something capable of completely destroying it. But there is a positive side to this, right? It means we have perfectly learned and mastered certain mechanisms. We have introduced technology. A famous German philosopher, Heidegger, who wasn't a very likable man, but certainly a very intelligent one, because you can be highly intelligent and still be a jerk. Intelligence is no guarantee of goodness or likability. So, this very intelligent man, Heidegger, rightly said that technology possesses man, not man possesses technology. When we introduce a technology into the world, whether it's the atomic bomb, the ultrasound machine, the CT scan, or plastic, it is there. It stays, and it dominates you. You aren't the one dominating it. However, we have a brain that has been capable of dramatically modifying the planet. As I said, I'm an old man now, and while I'd love to go back in time, I can't. But if you manage to modify, literally changing your brain, as they say in English, and I mean that in the sense that culture modifies the brain. So, if your generation is able to change your approach to the world through technology, the very technology that is currently causing us such trouble, then through that same technology, we will be able to find the solutions. Of this, I am convinced. It will be up to you to use technology wisely.
Exactly. In the end, it always comes down to the intent behind it all, doesn't it? It makes me think that as long as the primary goal remains maximizing profit, environmental health will never truly be factored into the equation. It's filtered through a lens that unfortunately barely even considers these variables. We need to put a stop or set some boundaries to these things. But as you said, it's not so much a matter of intellect or intelligence or understanding the facts. It's really about intent. It's almost a fundamental value that says, let's preserve this.
Going back to Heidegger again, he notes that modern man no longer looks at the world with wonder. We should look at the world with wonder, the way the Aristotelians or Platonists did. Instead, we view it merely as an object to be exploited. That is, when I look at a forest, I just see timber to be chopped down so I can make a profit. When I look at a river, I see a place to build a dam to generate hydroelectric power. Even though it's considered alternative energy, I'm not a fan of it because it destroys the ecosystem. Regardless, we look at the world exclusively through the lens of exploitation. This is what needs to change. We need to look at the world with wonder once again. If your generation is able to look at the world with wonder once more, the world will change, because the world can change. It won't be easy, but it can be done.
We are the ones who need to change. As Sitting Bull famously said, when the last tree is cut down and the last river is dried up, only then will we realize that we cannot eat money.
Let's just hope we realize it sooner than that.
Exactly. All right, thank you so much. We're going to wrap things up here. Professor Ragusa, we thank you immensely for being with us, for sharing your experience, your vision, and above all, the urgency of this. Let's call it an invisible challenge that affects us all. What has come to light today shouldn't leave us indifferent. Let's reiterate, micro and nanoplastics are no longer just an environmental issue. They have infiltrated our bodies, our homes, and our biological systems, right down to the cellular level, as you explained, and so on. This puts the very future of human health at stake. So it is clear from your words that we can no longer afford to be indifferent or passive. We need research, awareness, and robust political action. In short, we need to start uniting around this goal. Once again, thank you. We invite everyone to share this interview. If you enjoyed listening to Professor Ragusa, who has enlightened us today with his expertise and insights, please talk about it, stay informed, and educate others. And if you're interested in learning more, head over to our YouTube channel to watch the documentary our team has put together on this very topic. Thank you again, Professor Ragusa, and thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you for the important work you do. Goodbye.